Hi there, my name is Sushanti Gomez, and this is my artist talk. So basically, I'm a fine art third year student, and today I'd like to detail elements of my work and the development of my practice from foundation through my third year. So this was the start of my foundation, and a lot of my iconography was based on portraiture, but what I realized was being in foundation that you had to work quite quickly and quite creatively, and I sort of felt really stumped and almost defeated because a lot of my work didn't stand up the way that I wanted to, because a lot of my standards were based on appropriation and appropriating film stills and working on it for months. So this was definitely a big change, sort of seeing myself within the contemporary aspect. But then towards the end of the year, Recycle Upcycle, I did this piece based on a pub, which is quite local in Farnham, and I did it in Van Gogh style because I started to take to Van Gogh quite well, actually. So that was his piece called The Night Cafe, and that became quite an interesting point of reference for me. Another point of reference was David Verbeek's film Full Contact, which I saw in Amsterdam at the Eye Institute. And it basically shows the duality of like two video projections. And it made me consider video for the first time because I never looked at it. So this depicts an aerial, detached, mechanical sort of combat. And the same soldier who operates this machinery is faced within the ring and the limitations of a physical combat. And I thought the duality of that was quite interesting. Moving on to first year. So it was me playing around shadow figures and using Van Gogh, but I felt like the finished piece that I did for my crit was quite almost a bit too much and came off a bit flimsy, which I wasn't a big fan of. But then I realized this interest through image, surface, and material, an activity that we did where I used an original picture, then I used a painted version of it on an unprimed canvas, cut it up sculpturally, reconfigured it, and then took a photograph of it. So it took a 2D to 3D to 2D concept, and playing around negative and positive spaces was a really interesting way of seeing just how quickly I could work through image manipulation through Be Funky, a photo editor. So that was quite interesting. Point of reference through my essay, came across Jane Louise Wilson's Stasi City, an open cube immersive installation. What I like about it was the fact that it was based on a corner wall. I didn't actually see this video, but what I did see was Gamma, and that was quite an accessible video where it sort of put you in the situation of it. And I can imagine with the projections being like this, sort of immersing the viewer within it was a really interesting concept that I didn't quite put together, only I think until sort of contextually understanding it within my third year. I thought it was quite interesting. So that's Kiran, Ray of Sunshine, and Kiran is a name based in Sanskrit, and that's what it means. And essentially it was my stance on pro-life, and that was how I rendered it as a sculpture. Materials used was air drying clay and a sort of shiny material, so trying to find that balance between grotesque yet quite precious was really interesting for me. And it sort of based it on the idea of questioning, putting a question in people's heads on the concept or the personhood of a child without the gore and the grotesque elements of blood and blaming people necessarily. Just more of a notion. From that, I developed it into this for the Menhir Gallery at the South Bank. It was a London show that I did with my class, and that was the painted element that I did to what was previously the sculptural piece. This is Anselm Kiefer, an artist that I came across for the London Gallery visits in the White Cube in Bermondsey in 2017, and elements of the sublime within the unbelievable scale of his work and just the minimal use of certain things and just the narratives that came from it that resonated so much with very little to say. And that's Dale Lewis's work. So that's E Street, and that's Acid Man's Funeral. And these are paintings that I came across in the Saatchi Gallery, and their scale is about 200 by 400 centimeters and take him about a day to make. There are elements of British humor to it. What I really admired about him was the fact that he was interested in Van Gogh as well. And really early on, he tried to copy his sunflowers, and he actually did really intricate work. So he engaged himself in residencies and did one with Rakib Shaw, really intricate work, and then sort of realized where his stance was and where he was within his work. And that's where he started to look at distancing himself a little bit from the criticality and, the research, to let his own work emerge in a sense. So Acid Man's Funeral is based on a story of that he knew growing up, and like this iconography of a certain person that he knew of in his town. And East Street was sort of a place that he visited and sort of wanted to recapture. And he maintains a very classical composition to it, as it sort of acts as an armature for him in his work. And I thought that was quite impressive, just what it had to say. So that was the curatorial project, which we had to do in our second year. And what it did was it sort of opened me up to different avenues that I probably wouldn't have previously looked at had it not been for this unit. I went to Folkestone, I got myself out there, and it was just really interesting to see the process of it. So moving on to my third year, after taking a gap year, interest of my son, because I had my child after I finished my second year, really came about, and that gap year really helped me sort of take into account various points of how I would do my work and sort of reconfigure how I would work and how much I would make. And this was the project No Strings Attached, and the idea was to have almost limited resources or material, or to pare down material. So I used this material, which is essentially something you'd wrap flowers in. So I didn't realize it was actually a Lowry. And that little figure right there, that's me with the pushchair. And that iconography is something I extended on massively in my work. I used the reference of his passport photograph, and even looking at the inside and outside within two different materials of how the formation of a baby grow would take into effect. These were artists that helped me frame the basis of my work. And that was one of my outcomes, Baby Traces, which was quite simple. Usage of video and finger and tactility and moving him around the wall. It's a still of it. And that was inspired by the movie Ghost, which starred Patrick Swayze, and the idea of that scene with the coin and that sort of really simple gesture of showing a presence within a space, although not being physically there for people to see, and notions within that which I thought were quite interesting that I wanted to depict within my piece. This was my crit piece, and what it did was it sort of documented my son at this stage of his development, so touching things that he shouldn't, scaling, and I took him to the studios to actually do the video of this. Make the video of this, to have him sort of scale the wall a bit, or rather cruise around it and project it onto the radiator, with the paintings being sort of envisioned at child's height. I was actually quite proud of this piece, to be honest, something very different. This is Beyond the Horizon, a piece that I did to sort of reflect the feeling of being overwhelmed and sort of wanting to be taken over by the iconography of the sunlight, my son, his name meaning ray of sunshine. And it was during a very difficult period. But yeah, following on from that artist reference, that's Gordon Chung, and that's Caspar David Friedrich. And I came across him through a Gordon Chung artist talk. It looks at element of the gaze and sense of enveloping the viewer within how you position the figure, which I thought was interesting, and the three horsemen, because Gordon Chung uses stock exchange indices in his work and spray paint, among many other materials, to show a sort of dystopian figure that have elements that reign on the socio-political strata, which I sort of wanted to take some form of reference to, and I sort of did that in the triptych within this. So these are baby grows that I had help. I started engaging more in the workshops, and they helped me create an armature. And I stuffed the baby grows, I used mod rock, and the thing with that was that I never went into the workshops before, and I think it's really important to persist and push, because you pay for, these services, and it's really important to sort of get all of your wildest dreams sort of envisioned. And this sculptural piece I was actually really happy with. Again, developing my son's development. I didn't want the heads to be there because I felt like it would make it almost too literal. Like I was trying to be a sculptor where I'm not, and it was just the movements that I was trying to depict. Bet 365 was something I took from Gordon Chung's use of imagery. So this was through Be Funky, a photo editor. And what I did was based it on something that was sort of enveloping me at the time. So I would take jockey jerseys, screenshot them, sort of saturate the color, and have all of these ribbons basically represent a jockey jersey and the iconography of Bet365, and me sort of being in the center of it, sort of in this sort of dystopian setting. So this is Beyond the Scan, something I developed from Beyond the Horizon, where I painted over it using ink and then used acetone where my hands to show the tactility of it as well, if you can see, to take away the ink from it, but still sort of have some element of the figure. I used fake blood to sort of show the opacity within the figure. Quite liked the effect of it. And then I developed that further into an animation almost. So I overlaid an animation on top of this to show a child within the gestation of 9 to 12 weeks in the womb. It sort of plays on the idea of that gaze, that medical gaze, that first gaze that you see of your child. References to past and present sort of coming into it. And yeah, I really quite like the use of that. So this piece was playing again on the iconography of the figure, but this time using my dad. So that was a foundation piece that I did, and I really wasn't happy with it. But it used my dad in the iconography of the sunset, and this came during a time my son was actually admitted into hospital, and it just came right after that to just make work and to sort of immerse the viewer into the setting. This is very long. William Kentridge basically is South African, amazing artist who works with animation. What I really liked about this piece called Ubu Tells the Truth is that it's made of a base of 30 sketches, and again, a socio-political strata. And within this, theme, the idea of it, how it implicates the viewer, the recorder and perpetrator equally in the violence it depicts, sort of really strong renderings of that I came across in the Tate. And then I started on it through baby movements, where I started to, this is basically sanguine, and it's over a board that's a canvas stretched over a board that I primed with white gouache. And then I started taking elements of it away with chalk every time I changed the movements little by little. And that was development, something that was overlaid on Beyond the Scan. So that's the development piece that I was working on, playing with backlighting and Hubert Damisch's origin of perspective, the idea of backlighting and how you sort of frame the right sort of perspective, and just playing around with it really. Sculptural elements within my work looked at the Tower of Jericho, where previously I showed the paintings to it. I didn't realize that there was an actual sculptural reference, and I used the domesticity of my son's stacky blocks and his dad's Foster's cans, so sort of recreated as sort of a Tower of Babel almost. That was what I did right before isolation. I sort of put the two pieces together to sort of create a conversation almost. And other references, Matt Collishaw and Richard Billingham, sort of show this really interesting set within the domestic setting, which I really quite liked, that I sort of envisioned into a painting that sort of showed my personal narrative. And this painting was done with use of my partner's, using materiality still. So that's his work trousers, and it goes on the outside elements of his work trousers, an inside element, and the idea of the light within an intimate setting sort of taking over the iconography of the sunlight, and my son in the center of it. And I thought it was, quite an interesting thing to bring in. So these were theories that helped frame my work. I sort of got into that more. So Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space, intimate immensity, how something really simple, the idea of situationist theory, derive, détournement, sort of placing myself into the situation, looking at the psychogeographical nature of my work and where it was going within the domestic setting, within a pub, forms of appropriation through détournement, which I had been working on a lot anyways. The Object Stares Back by James Elkins, where the object and the act of looking is a very powerful thing, and the object becomes more with the viewer as the viewer becomes part of the object, and that sort of relationship within that, which was quite interesting. What I really, really liked about this piece, Work Nights, was that using Richard Billingham's reference to how he videoed his dad, I think what really inspired me was the sense of not being afraid to show a personal narrative to your work and open up about it a little bit. Playing the element in the gaze, the dad's completely just not looking at me, whereas my son is. And yes, I used Matt Collishaw largely as my reference over here, that classical setting in a photographic form taking a painting form. But I sort of feel like, yeah, I sort of feel like my work has really developed a lot, and I've learned a lot through, understanding a lot of things, especially in the third year, applying for various opportunities. It's helped me understand things a lot better than I would have previously, and sort of see myself within the frame of the art world. And I think it's really important to realize that, you have your own timeline to things. You're never late, you're never early. Sometimes it's a development progress. Where I am now, I honestly wish I was in my first year, to be honest with you, because I felt so lost. But I'm actually a lot happier that I'm here now with all of this research, all of these concepts, and they're very honest to me. And I think it's really important to know where you stand and what proximity you can have within your work and your references. I think that's very important. And yeah, I guess that is where I will draw my presentation to an end.